This video is going to cover the leather rune stone pack. Now it will come with the satchel pattern in there as well, so you can have a nice little satchel for your rune stones, but you don't necessarily even have to make the rune stones. There's going to be a blank page so you can lay out the letters, so you can put some letters on a different project that you have. There will be different shapes, so you can decide what size, what shape you want to cut them out, and if you don't want to cut them out, there's going to be all kinds of different lines for tooling as well. I'll cover some of the ways that I would tool these, but really it's limitless. I'd also like to thank the Leather Crafters and Saddlers Journal for sponsoring my channel. Great publication and people. They do a ton for the community, put on shows, bring teachers together for people to learn, expand the craft. I'll put a link to their website down below. So see, there's all kinds of different lines that you can go from. There's going to be 2 different sets, and then in each one of those sets there's going to be a bunch of different lines that you can either cut it out as like a rune stone itself, or you can use just the stitching or the squared off shaded areas, the round areas. You see there's corners that are square or it's rounded off. This is the separate one. You can trace them, and what I'll do is I'll trace a few on here, and you can tool, depress some of that area like a reverse bevel, and then sew. You do all kinds of different shapes and whatnot for these rune stones. And there's also going to be a blank page, so like with my alphabet, you can line these up if you want to kind of spell something out with rune stones. Okay, I moistened the leather, got it cased a little bit here, and I put tape across all of these. But what I did is I pressed it against a shirt and just kind of did this a little, got it not as sticky so it doesn't mess with this leather, but it's still sticky enough to hold it on there. Let that hold that in place. I'm going to trace which ones I'm going to tool and that kind of thing here. So usually if I'm just going to stitch and just make the stones, I'm not going to tape it down like this. I'll cut close to that line and then just tape it down with the sticky tape. It doesn't matter how sticky. Punch the holes and then just cut it out like I do most of my other patterns and things. But since I'm going to kind of do a bunch of different ways here, this is how I'll tape stuff down if I need to trace. So with this first one, I'm just going to trace this outside line. And you can cut this out, or you can tool it or do whatever you want. This one, it's got the rounded. With this one, when you're tracing something real small, it's always better to trace just outside. It's better to trace just outside of the line you're tracing. I think for this one, I'll bevel around the stone, but then maybe do a texture, and then do a reverse bevel for this inside section. So before I take this tape off and cut everything with a swivel knife and tool what I'm going to tool, I'm just going to punch all the holes first with this stitching chisel. So now I'm going to tool some of these up a little bit. Just use a beveler. It's just a small Berry King beveler. Very similar to the Tandy one, it's just a little smaller. Sometimes the Tandy one is a little bit sharp, but you can sand down those sharp edges a little bit. Not on this one, the Tandy one. So I'll go through and tool these how I want. What I'll do is I'll use this to get that detail in, then I'll go back with a big figure beveler to smooth everything out, maybe with a modeling spoon too. So while you're tooling this, sometimes it's kind of hard to see where that bevel mark is, so I'll have lights set up in a couple different spots, and sometimes even I'll set one down on the table shining directly across, let that light hit it a little different, and you can see right where you need to touch this up. So you can see as I'm beveling, you're not seeing much, maybe a tiny bit right here, but you don't want to cut too deep. The only time you want to cut real deep is if you're trying to if you're doing more of a three-dimensional tooling and you want this corner on the higher side to stay real sharp for boxes and things. Otherwise, you don't really want to cut very deep at all. That way that leather doesn't open up and you won't see the flesh in there. It'll look a little smoother too. I got them pretty much tooled here. I'll throw a picture up. But I think what I'll do is, like some of these, because they look like stone anyways, you can grab a swivel knife and add some cracks. Just start a little deeper and then make it get shallow right away. Something like that. And you can go reverse too for the ones that are raised up. Put some cracks coming into them. So I'm going to do a backgrounder around this one. And what I have is a Tandy. It's like a pebbled backgrounder. M881. And then I also have the larger round one. This is a M882. But I ground one of the sides down so that I can get it up close. And what I did is I made some impressions, and then I found the side I wanted to grind off to leave the nicest, the part I liked the most on there. I didn't just grind some random side off. But that way I can still get it real close, but you'll see I'll rotate it still. But as far as this one goes, I just get real close to the edge. And I don't rotate it around because that one can get close enough. So I'm using a stitching chisel instead of a hole punch. I'm going to be leaving this plain leather, so I find it looks a little bit cleaner if I use just a chisel. But making sure each one of these lines straight across as I'm doing it. And I watch each hole, so when I place this down I'm seeing exactly half of that dot each time. If I just go and just place it on the hole, they're not going to line up quite as well. So I just go around the outside. It doesn't need to be perfect this first time. And these rounded corners, I just cut sharp. Since this is simulating like a rune stone or something, it doesn't need to be perfect. The cuts do need to be straight. I like how that looks a little bit better. But it really isn't that crucial even. So once I get this cut out of here, I still just cut all the lines, sharp corners, then I'll trim it after the fact. I'll a lot of times keep this little piece of paper sitting there so I can have it more accurate as to what I wanted it to look like to begin with. A little bit harder for me to cut these out sitting down. Usually I stand up. Alright, so once I get that cut out, some of the lines aren't going to be cut straight. As far as up and down, the knife was twisting or something like that. So I'll hold it straight up and down and just nick these edges and clean this up. And anywhere there was a corner that doesn't want to be sharp, I want it rounded, you just make a few passes as you're going around the corner. Clean up any of the double cuts and fuzz that's sticking out. I'm holding my knife a little bit flatter. So if this was the table, instead of coming in like this, I'm holding a little bit flatter, and I just nick it on the back of the blade. And then finish it up. Just let it nick that corner, couple times. It's important to have a sharp blade while you're doing this. You can take a little bit of sandpaper or something to the edges if you want before you burnish them. I usually don't. If you cut them nice and smooth, you shouldn't have to. It's like I was saying, if I'm going to stitch this and just back stitch so both the front and the back look the same, I'll just cut it clean like this, sand it, get the edges done. But if I'm going to sew it so it's just a single thread that you see, you're going to have to tie a knot in the back, and on some of these letters that are more complicated, you're going to have to hop around on the back so it looks nice and clean on the front. And when I do that, I back it with another thin piece of leather. Or maybe this is like a 10 ounce, maybe do 2 layers of like a 6 ounce or a 5 ounce. And if that's the case, then I don't worry about trimming it up quite as nice. I'll do that, trim it just real quick, and then after I glue it, I'll clean that up and sand it and burnish the edges. First I'm going to show you how I thread a needle. Put it through the needle, and then you come back on the thread and go through the center. The thicker wax stuff is a little bit stickier, but you can see how much it really locks it in there. Alright, so I got one of these leather rune stones in here. And you can tell the hole has got that angle to it. So since the top of the hole, this angle is higher, closer to this hole on this side, when I come through, I use this needle to guide this through. When I come through, I want this thread to be down so that this thread comes across to the closest section of that hole. That way the angle of the hole helps that angle of the thread. We'll just make it look a lot cooler, a lot cleaner, more professional. And if I get a needle stuck, sometimes just backing up and turning a little bit, something about the shape of the needle, allows it just to go through. I don't always have to force it, and I never use pliers because I find it chews up the needle and just creates more resistance. And you can already see how it's getting that angle to it. So it's sticking. I'll just come out, give it a spin, and it goes through a little easier. I find too with thick wax thread, since it's sticky and thicker, you can really wrench on it, so you gotta be careful not to just pull and rip through. And I was coming back this way, so you saw me holding the thread down and coming across, but now that I hit that corner, I'm coming this way, you can see the closest section of each one of these holes is on the bottom. So this thread that's about to go back through wants to go down to the bottom of the next hole. So this thread that came from the back, I'm holding up. So I get that nice angle to each one of these. So I'll sew these up and then we'll do the edges. You can see that nice angle to those stitches. If I was to reverse it and go back and forth on either side, it would look pretty crooked and sloppy. Much more professional if you make sure to pull that thread to the same side each time. Alright, I just ran this one through my burnisher on my drill press. Nice and shiny, smooth. And sometimes you'll notice, like if this ridge pops up a little, it shouldn't be much at all, but you can rub it down a little bit. But one thing I like to do sometimes is if the water's getting across them edges a little, give it a little spray from the front. That way you won't have any of those water stains around your edge. It'll look nice and clean and you'll only see that burnish. But I may run that through twice. This is just once. And the other thing I like to do, I'll grab this canvas and come up to the corner. First I hit the table, then the leather, just to give it a little bit more of a burnish on that corner there. So what I did is I took 3 layers of canvas instead of fighting it, and when it's 1 layer I started to get a blister from the friction. So with 3 layers it gives me a little more insulation, so I'm not going to heat my finger up too much. And I sewed them together because then I'm not fighting those layers to stay together. They don't come apart constantly. So it's like a little burnishing pad basically.